A man named Robert Desnick spent 9 months in a cell smaller than a parking space. No window, no clock. The light never turned off. He wasn't in solitary as punishment for violence. He was there because the prison said it was protective custody. According to documentation reviewed by the Vera Institute of Justice, thousands of incarcerated people across the United States are held in conditions like this every single day, not as exceptional punishment, but as routine prison management. And when Desnick finally got out, when the door opened and someone handed him a bus ticket and $40, he stood on a sidewalk for 11 minutes without moving. He told a journalist later, he didn't know which direction to walk. He'd forgotten how. That's not the story you've been told about prison. The story you've been told is about bars, jumpsuits, violence between inmates, maybe a few corrupt guards. But that story is missing something. Something systemic. Something that happens not in spite of the rules, but because of them. What you're about to hear is based on documented cases, federal investigations, survivor testimony, and decades of official records that most people never read. 5 chapters, 1 institution, and by the end, you will never think about incarceration the same way again. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The intake. The handcuffs come off. But that's the last moment of anything resembling control you'll have for a very long time. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than 600,000 people enter America's state and federal prisons every single year. Another 10 million cycle through local jails. That's not a statistic that fits easily in your head. So think of it this way. Every 25 seconds, someone in the United States begins the intake process. And almost none of them are prepared for what that process actually is. The intake process has been documented extensively by the ACLU, the Marshall Project, and multiple federal court filings. What those documents describe is not simply being processed. It is, in the words of one federal judge reviewing conditions at Rikers Island in 2022, a systematic and deliberate dismantling of individual identity. It begins with clothing. Your clothes are taken. Whatever you were wearing when they arrested you, your shirt, your shoes, the jacket your mother bought you, goes into a plastic bag. That bag gets tagged with a number. From this moment forward, in many facilities, you are that number. You are issued a uniform. In most state facilities, it is orange or khaki, depending on classification. The uniform is not sized for you. Former inmates interviewed by the Marshall Project consistently describe receiving clothes that don't fit, too large, too small, worn thin in places, sometimes still carrying the smell of the last person who wore them. Then comes classification. Classification determines almost everything about your incarceration: which facility you go to, which housing unit you're placed in, what programs you can access, what jobs are available to you, and critically, how much danger you will be in. The classification interview typically takes between 15 and 45 minutes. In that window, a corrections officer, often with no formal psychological or social work training, asks a series of standardized questions. Your offense, your criminal history, any gang affiliations, any enemies inside the system, any medical or mental health needs. The problem, documented in a 2019 Human Rights Watch report, is that this process is systematically flawed in ways that create cascading consequences. People with serious mental illness are frequently misclassified as behavioral problems. People fleeing gang persecution on the outside are sometimes housed near the very people they were running from. People with complex medical needs are placed in general population facilities without adequate care infrastructure. One case that illustrates this pattern involved a 26-year-old named Marcus Williams, documented in federal court filings from a 2020 class action lawsuit in Illinois. Williams had disclosed during intake that he suffered from bipolar disorder and had previously been hospitalized. His classification form noted a mental health flag. He was placed in general population anyway, because the mental health unit was at capacity. Within 6 weeks, he was in a physical altercation that sent him to the infirmary. The lawsuit documented that this was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. The medical screening at intake is, on paper, thorough. In practice, it is one of the most documented failure points in the entire correctional system. A 2021 Department of Justice investigation into conditions at several federal facilities found that intake medical screenings were frequently incomplete, sometimes taking less than 10 minutes, often conducted by staff with minimal medical training, and frequently failed to identify conditions that would later become emergencies. HIV, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, all highly prevalent inside correctional populations, are often not properly screened for during intake. According to the CDC, rates of HIV in state prisons are more than 7 times higher than in the general population. Hepatitis C rates are up to 12 times higher. But the intake screen isn't just about infectious disease. It's about mental health. And this is where the numbers become almost impossible to process. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than 37% of people in state prisons have a history of mental illness. In county jails, that number climbs to over 44%. Yet according to a Vera Institute analysis, fewer than 1 in 3 receive any mental health treatment while incarcerated. The gap between who needs care and who receives it is not a small administrative oversight. It is built into the architecture of the system. Before you get to your assigned cell, before the intake process is even complete, most newly arrived inmates spend time in a holding cell. This can last hours, or it can last days. In a 2022 investigation of Rikers Island, the New York City jail complex that houses roughly 5,500 people at any given time and has been under federal court oversight since 2015, journalists from the city documented men spending up to 72 hours in intake holding areas before being assigned housing. These areas were documented as severely overcrowded, with no beds, inadequate toilets, and little to no food. One man described waiting 58 hours in a room with 40 other people. He had not slept. He had eaten once. He had been given no information about where he was going or when. His name, his case, his charges, none of that is the point here. The point is that what he described is not an isolated horror story. Multiple independent investigations, court monitors, and federal oversight bodies have documented this pattern not just at Rikers, but at facilities across the country, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Houston, in rural county jails where oversight is even thinner. And here is what none of the paperwork captures: the noise. Former inmates, interviewed across multiple published accounts by the Marshall Project, the Sentencing Project, and independent journalists, describe the noise of intake as something that never quite leaves you. Steel doors, yelling, the PA system, the mechanical clang of every lock. It is relentless, and it begins the process that researchers at Yale School of Medicine have described as hypervigilance induction, the rewiring of a nervous system toward constant threat detection. Dr. Terry Kupers, a psychiatrist who has served as an expert witness in more than 40 prison condition cases, has testified that the conditions of intake alone, the noise, the disorientation, the loss of identity markers, are sufficient to cause measurable psychological harm in previously healthy individuals. That process begins in the first 24 hours. By the time you reach your assigned cell, you're already a different person than the one who walked through the door. And you haven't even met your cellmate yet. The cell. The average American prison cell is 60 square feet. That is smaller than most parking spaces. Smaller than the average bathroom in a mid-range hotel. And in that space, in many facilities across the United States, 2 people are expected to live, sleep, eat, use the toilet, exist, sometimes for years. The Bureau of Justice Statistics documented in its most recent national survey that more than 38% of state prison inmates are housed in cells designed for fewer people than currently occupy them. In some state systems, that number exceeds 50%. But overcrowding is only the beginning of what the cell does to you. In 2003, a neuroscientist named Dr. Craig Haney submitted testimony to the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. Dr. Haney had spent more than 2 decades studying the psychological effects of incarceration. He had interviewed hundreds of inmates across dozens of facilities. His conclusion was not subtle. He testified that prolonged confinement in a standard prison cell, not solitary, just a regular cell, produces measurable and sometimes permanent changes in brain function, specifically in the areas governing impulse control, emotional regulation, and threat assessment. The brain, Haney explained, is adaptive. It responds to its environment. And when that environment is characterized by constant threat, constant noise, constant restriction of movement, and total loss of autonomy, the brain rewires itself accordingly. It does not do this to punish you. It does this to keep you alive. In many maximum security facilities, inmates spend between 22 and 23 hours per day inside their cells. 1 hour, sometimes less, for recreation. In many facilities, that recreation takes place not in an open yard, but in a slightly larger concrete enclosure, sometimes indoors, sometimes alone. A 2022 investigation by the Marshall Project documented daily schedules at 5 different maximum security facilities across 3 states. The average time outside a cell across those 5 facilities was 68 minutes per day. Think about what 68 minutes outside means. You wake up inside the cell. You eat inside the cell. Food pushed through a slot or delivered on a tray. You exercise inside the cell if you exercise at all. Push-ups on a concrete floor, pacing a space 6 feet wide. You use the toilet inside the cell, often with a cellmate present. You sleep inside the cell under a light that, in many facilities, never fully turns off. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the body adapts too. Former inmates consistently described, in memoirs, in journalism, in court testimony, in academic interviews, a phenomenon that researchers have begun to formally document: the erosion of the ability to tolerate open space. It has a name. Researchers at the University of California studying formerly incarcerated individuals described it in a 2018 paper as spatial agoraphobia, a conditioned anxiety response triggered by open or unstructured environments after prolonged confinement. It shows up in small ways at first: sitting with your back to a wall in a restaurant, feeling exposed in a parking lot, needing to see every exit before you can relax in a room. Damon Thibodeau spent 15 years on death row in Louisiana, later exonerated by DNA evidence in 2012. In interviews following his release, he described being unable to sleep without a wall close to his face for months after leaving prison. His body had learned that proximity to a wall meant safety. Open space meant danger. His case is documented. His account is verified. And his experience, researchers say, is not unusual. Solitary confinement. The term is used casually. It is not casual. According to a 2023 report from the Unlock the Box campaign, a coalition of civil rights and health organizations, approximately 122,000 people in the United States are held in solitary confinement on any given day. That figure includes state prisons, federal facilities, immigration detention, and local jails. 122,000 people in cells that typically measure 6 by 9 feet, with 22 to 24 hours of isolation per day, for periods that can extend not just to weeks or months, but to years, sometimes decades. The record in American documented cases, reviewed in a 2020 investigation by the American Friends Service Committee, involves an inmate who spent more than 40 consecutive years in solitary confinement at Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana. His name was Albert Woodfix. He was a member of the Angola 3, a group of inmates whose case drew international human rights attention. Albert Woodfix was released in 2016 after his conviction was overturned. He was 69 years old. He had entered solitary at age 29. The medical and psychological literature on solitary confinement is now extensive, consistent, and damning. Dr. Stuart Grassian, a Harvard Medical School psychiatrist, conducted landmark research beginning in the 1980s. Research that has since been replicated and expanded by institutions including Stanford, Yale, and Columbia. His findings documented a specific psychiatric syndrome produced by solitary confinement that included hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, paranoia, difficulties with thinking and concentration, and, in a significant percentage of subjects, hallucinations. These are not people with pre-existing psychosis. These were people whose brains, deprived of normal sensory and social input, began generating their own. The human brain requires stimulation to function. It requires social contact. It requires variation. When those inputs are removed systematically, deliberately, over extended periods, the brain does not simply go quiet. It turns on itself. The correlation between incarceration and mental health deterioration is one of the most heavily documented relationships in correctional research. According to a 2021 analysis by the Vera Institute of Justice, people who enter prison without a diagnosed mental illness have a significantly elevated risk of developing one during incarceration compared to demographically similar individuals in the general population. The risk factors are not mysterious. Chronic stress, sleep disruption. Studies have documented that prison noise levels, even at night, frequently exceed levels that sleep researchers associate with health consequences. Social isolation, loss of autonomy, exposure to violence and the constant threat of violence, lack of access to nature. None of those things are present inside a prison cell. And then there is the cellmate, being assigned to share a 60-square-foot space with another human being, a person you did not choose, whose history you do not know, whose stability you cannot assess, is one of the defining features of incarcerated life that receives almost no public attention. At best, a cellmate becomes something like a lifeline, someone to talk to, someone who can teach you the rules of a specific facility, someone whose presence, however constrained, represents human connection in an environment designed to minimize it. At worst, the cellmate is a source of danger. A 2019 Department of Justice report on prison violence documented that a significant percentage of inmate-on-inmate assaults occur within cells, in the confined space where there is no escape, no witnesses except the walls, and often a delay of hours before any staff intervention. The Bureau of Justice Statistics found in its most recent survey of prison inmates that approximately 19% of incarcerated people reported being threatened or physically assaulted by another inmate during their current sentence. In a cell, you cannot leave. Night in a maximum security prison is its own phenomenon. The lights dim, but they do not go out. In many facilities, a reduced fluorescent light runs all night for security monitoring purposes. The result is a state of permanent partial light, not bright enough to read, not dark enough for the brain to fully shift into deep sleep cycles. Sleep researchers studying incarcerated populations have documented chronically disrupted sleep architecture, specifically the reduction of slow wave and REM sleep, in inmates across multiple facility types. Over weeks, this produces the same cognitive effects as clinical sleep deprivation, impaired judgment, emotional dysregulation, heightened aggression, reduced executive function. A 2020 study measuring actual decibel levels inside a medium security facility at night found that average noise levels rarely fell below 55 decibels, equivalent to a running dishwasher, and frequently spiked to levels associated with workplace hearing protection requirements. Night after night after night. For years. The yard opens at 7 a.m. In most maximum security facilities, that moment, the click of the gate, the flood of gray morning light, the permission to move in a space larger than 60 square feet, is the most anticipated moment of the day. And it is also, by documented accounts, one of the most dangerous. Because the yard is not simply a place where inmates exercise. It is a society. It has its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own laws, its own courts, its own enforcement mechanisms. It has territories that are as real and as rigidly observed as any international border, invisible to the eye of a new arrival, instantly visible to everyone else. And if you walk into that yard without understanding any of this, if you sit in the wrong place, stand in the wrong area, approach the wrong group, the consequences can be immediate and severe. This is not speculation. It is documented in grievance records, court filings, investigative journalism, and the testimony of hundreds of formerly incarcerated individuals across every major prison system in the country. The yard has rules, and nobody gives you a rule book. The first rule of the yard, documented consistently across facilities from Rikers Island to Pelican Bay to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, is that you do not cross racial lines without invitation or established relationship. This is not a rule that prison administrations created. It is a rule that evolved over decades of incarceration, shaped by history, by violence, by the particular social dynamics of environments where people are stripped of most other markers of identity and group membership becomes a survival strategy. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley studying prison social organization, have described this phenomenon not as simple racism, though racism is certainly present, but as a rational response to an environment of scarcity and threat. When you cannot trust institutions to protect you, you trust the group nearest to you. The practical result is a yard divided. In most maximum security facilities, different areas of the yard are understood to belong to different groups. The weight pile, the basketball court, the track, the benches near the wall. Each space has its custodians, and those custodians have the ability to make life extremely difficult or extremely dangerous for anyone who disrespects the arrangement. The second thing you need to understand about the yard is that it runs on a parallel economy. The official prison commissary, the store where inmates can purchase approved items using funds deposited by family or earned through prison labor, is the foundation of that economy. But it is only the foundation. What gets built on top of it is something that multiple DOJ investigations and academic studies have described as a remarkably sophisticated underground market, one that mirrors, in compressed and dangerous form, the economic systems of the outside world. The primary currency in most facilities is not cash. Cash is contraband. For decades, cigarettes were the dominant currency. After smoking bans swept through American prisons beginning in the 1990s, the economy adapted. Ramen noodle packets became a de facto currency unit in many facilities. A 2016 study published in the American Economic Review, drawing on commissary data from a North Carolina prison system, formally documented the ramen economy, finding that ramen had become a more reliable medium of exchange than the official prison store account system in many transactions. But ramen is not the ceiling of the prison economy. It is the floor. Drugs move through the yard. A 2019 Bureau of Justice Statistics report found that approximately 58% of people in state prisons met the criteria for drug abuse or dependence at the time of their offense. Many of those people continue to use inside. In 2018, a federal investigation into contraband at the Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina documented systematic smuggling facilitated in part by corrections officers who were being paid in cash and commissary goods. The drugs that enter the yard change behavior on the yard. They create debt. And debt in a prison economy is not like debt in the outside world. Outside, if you owe someone money and can't pay, the consequences are financial. Inside, the consequences are physical. Former inmates and criminologists studying prison violence consistently identify debt, from drugs, from gambling, from transactions gone wrong, as one of the primary drivers of violence in correctional facilities. You borrow something. The interest on what you borrowed is steep. Accounts from multiple facilities describe informal lending rates of 100% or more payable within a week. You cannot pay. The lender escalates. First a warning, then a beating, then something worse. And because there are no external courts, no police, no legal mechanisms for dispute resolution, the enforcement is entirely physical. No discussion of the prison yard is complete without addressing gang structure. And this is where the gap between public perception and documented reality is widest. Prison gangs, or security threat groups, as correctional systems formally designate them, function in many facilities less like roving bands of violent criminals and more like parallel governance structures. They regulate disputes. They set prices in the informal economy. They provide protection to their members. They enforce norms of behavior that, while often brutal in their enforcement, provide a form of social order in an environment where official social order is frequently absent or inadequate. Dr. David Scarbeck, an economist at Brown University who has studied prison gangs extensively, has described this dynamic in terms that initially seem counterintuitive. In the absence of effective institutional governance, inmates create their own governance structures. Those structures are not benign, but they are functional. What that means for an ordinary inmate, someone who is not a gang member and does not want to be, is a choice that the system forces on them. Affiliation means protection and access to the informal economy. It also means obligations that can include acts of violence at the direction of leadership. Non-affiliation means independence. It also means vulnerability. There is no neutral ground in the yard. There is only the position you choose and the consequences of that choice. April 15th, 2018. Lee Correctional Institution, Bishopville, South Carolina. 7 inmates are killed. 22 are seriously injured. The violence lasts for more than 7 hours. It is the deadliest prison riot in the United States in 25 years. The South Carolina Department of Corrections' own after-action report documented what happened with unusual frankness. The violence was not random. It was the result of a territorial dispute between rival gang factions over control of the informal economy, specifically control of the drug trade and the debt collection networks within the facility. The dispute had been building for months. Warning signs had been documented in internal communications. The ratio of guards to inmates that night was dangerously inadequate. When the violence started, staff were outnumbered and could not safely intervene. They waited outside the dormitory for 7 hours. 7 men died inside. The corrections officer standing in the yard is, in many documented cases, as much a product of the system as the inmates. The average starting salary for a corrections officer in the United States, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, is approximately $38,000 per year. In some rural states, it is lower. A 2020 report from the Correctional Leadership Advancement Program documented annual turnover rates exceeding 30% at many facilities and exceeding 50% at some. What that means in practice is that many of the officers standing in that yard are new. They're undertrained. They're watching a social system of enormous complexity that they do not fully understand. And they're earning less than a starting teacher's salary to do it. Understanding the yard means understanding that the officer in the tower and the inmate in the yard are both, in different ways, trapped inside the same system. The medical ward. On September 12, 2018, a 57-year-old man named Larry Hope filed a medical request at a federal correctional facility in Kentucky. He had been experiencing chest pain for 3 days. According to court documents filed in a subsequent civil rights lawsuit, his request was logged, stamped, and placed in a queue. He was told he would be seen within 72 hours. He died of a cardiac event 31 hours later in his cell. His death is documented. His case became part of a broader federal investigation into medical care at Bureau of Prisons facilities that the DOJ Inspector General published in 2021. That report found systematic failures in medical response times, staffing levels, and the triage of urgent care requests across multiple federal facilities. Larry Hope's case was not exceptional. That is precisely the problem. In 1976, the United States Supreme Court established in Estelle v. Gamble that the deliberate indifference to the serious medical needs of prisoners constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. That ruling is now nearly 50 years old. In the decades since, it has generated an enormous body of litigation, and yet the pattern continues. A 2021 report by the Government Accountability Office examining healthcare in Bureau of Prisons facilities found that 13 of the 122 federal facilities reviewed had vacancy rates for medical positions exceeding 50%. Half of the medical jobs empty. In those facilities, a prisoner seeking medical care is not encountering a functioning healthcare system. They are encountering the skeleton of one. The fundamental difference between medical care inside prison and medical care outside is not just quality. It is power. Outside, if you are dissatisfied with your doctor, you can find another one. If you believe you're not receiving appropriate care, you can seek a second opinion. If your condition is deteriorating, you can go to an emergency room. Inside, none of those options exist. You submit a written medical request. That request is triaged by medical staff who are frequently overworked and understaffed. If your condition is not deemed urgent, you wait. The wait can be days. It can be weeks. And during that wait, you are still locked in your cell for 22 hours a day. You are entirely dependent on a system that multiple federal investigations have found to be systematically inadequate. The power imbalance in prison healthcare is total. The physical healthcare failures in American prisons are serious and well documented. The mental health failures are, by virtually every measure, worse. The United States has more people with serious mental illness in prisons and jails than in psychiatric hospitals, by a ratio of approximately 10 to 1. This is not a new finding. It has been documented since the early 1990s, following the wave of deinstitutionalization that closed state psychiatric hospitals beginning in the 1960s and 70s. What happened when those hospitals closed is now a matter of historical record. The people who needed those hospitals did not disappear. Many of them cycled into homelessness. Many cycled into the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system, prisons and jails, became, by default, the largest mental health providers in the country. Without being designed for that role, without being funded for that role, without being staffed for that role. The case of Kalief Browder is one of the most documented and consequential cases in the recent history of American incarceration. Browder was 16 years old when he was arrested in the Bronx in 2010 on suspicion of stealing a backpack. He maintained his innocence throughout. He was sent to Rikers Island because his family could not afford the $3,000 bail set by the court. He spent 3 years at Rikers awaiting trial. During those 3 years, documented in surveillance footage, medical records, and subsequent journalistic investigations, Browder spent approximately 2 of those years in solitary confinement. He was beaten by corrections officers. He was beaten by other inmates. He attempted suicide multiple times while in custody. The charges against him were eventually dropped in 2013. There was never a trial. Kalief Browder was released. 2 years later, in June 2015, he died by suicide at his family home. He was 22 years old. His case triggered federal oversight of Rikers Island, legislative action in New York State, and a national conversation about pretrial detention and mental health care in jails. It did not, by most measures, fundamentally change the system. Between 2008 and 2019, according to data compiled by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 57,000 people died in American prisons and jails. 57,000. The suicide rate in American jails is, according to the most recent BJS data, approximately 3 times higher than in the general population. In prisons, it is approximately twice as high. These are not anomalies in an otherwise functional system. They are outputs of a system operating as designed. One of the least discussed crises in American corrections is one that is accelerating by the year. The prison population is aging. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the number of state and federal prisoners aged 55 and older has grown by more than 400% since 1993. This is a direct consequence of mandatory minimum sentencing laws, truth in sentencing requirements, and the lengthening of average sentences that characterized American criminal justice policy from the 1980s onward. People who entered the system in their 20s and 30s are now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. They are developing the diseases of aging inside facilities that were not designed to manage those diseases: dementia, cancer, end-stage organ failure, mobility impairments. A 2019 investigation by the Marshall Project documented prisoners with dementia being housed in general population, confused, vulnerable, frequently victimized because there were no appropriate housing alternatives. Prisoners with terminal cancer dying in facility infirmaries that functioned less like hospice units and more like storage rooms. One case documented in that investigation involved a 74-year-old man, a Virginia state prisoner serving a life sentence, who had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. His family petitioned for compassionate release so he could die at home. The petition was denied on procedural grounds. He died in the facility infirmary 6 weeks later. His family was not present. Compassionate release exists in the federal system and in most state systems. In practice, it functions as one of the most dysfunctional components of an already dysfunctional system. A 2020 report by the DOJ Inspector General documented cases in which prisoners who had applied for compassionate release died before their applications were processed. The median processing time for a compassionate release application in the federal system, according to that report, was 175 days. For a prisoner with a terminal diagnosis, 175 days can be a life sentence of a different kind. There is one dimension of prison health care that receives almost no public attention and yet represents one of the most documented areas of systemic failure: pregnant women in prison. According to data from the Prison Policy Initiative, approximately 58,000 women enter American jails while pregnant each year. A 2020 investigation by The Appeal documented cases across multiple states in which incarcerated pregnant women were denied prenatal vitamins, denied adequate nutrition, denied timely access to obstetric care, and in some cases, went into labor without immediate medical attention. The practice of shackling women during labor, restraining their ankles or wrists while giving birth, was documented in facilities in multiple states. Despite being prohibited by law in more than 20 states, the practice has continued to be documented in court filings and investigative reports. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Medical Association, and multiple other major medical organizations have issued statements condemning the practice as medically dangerous and ethically indefensible. It continues. Everything documented in this chapter, the inadequate mental health care, the delayed treatment, the aging population, the pregnant women, the Caliph Browders, exists inside a system from which, eventually, most people emerge. Approximately 95% of incarcerated people in the United States will be released at some point. They will walk out carrying everything the system did to their bodies and their minds. Untreated mental illness. Chronic conditions that were identified but not properly managed. The physiological consequences of years of sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, chronic stress, and inadequate exercise. And they will walk out, in many cases with $40 and a bus ticket, into a world that expects them to function. The gate closes at 6 a.m. Not because that is a meaningful time, not because the world is ready for you at 6 a.m., but because that is when the shift changes and the paperwork needs to be processed before the next shift arrives. So you stand on a sidewalk, or a bus stop, or a parking lot outside a facility that may be in the middle of nowhere, and you hold a plastic bag containing the clothes you were arrested in, however many years ago, and an envelope with $40 in it. $40. That is the gate money provided to released inmates in many American states. Some states provide more. Some provide less. A 2021 survey by the Prison Policy Initiative found that 11 states still provide $50 or less in gate money upon release. 2 states, at the time of the survey, provided no gate money at all. $40 does not buy you a deposit on an apartment. It does not buy you a week of groceries. It does not buy you a phone plan, a bus pass, or a set of clothes appropriate for a job interview. It is not enough to bridge the gap between the prison gate and functional independence. Not even close. Researchers who study recidivism have identified the first 72 hours after release as one of the highest risk windows in the entire reentry process. In those first 72 hours, a person leaving prison must typically accomplish an almost impossible list of tasks, simultaneously, with no money, no support infrastructure, and a brain that has been systematically conditioned by years of institutional living to be hypervigilant, distrustful, and dependent on external structure. They need identification. Without ID, you cannot open a bank account. You cannot apply for most jobs. You cannot access most social services. You cannot rent an apartment. They need housing. The shelter system in most American cities has waiting lists. Transitional housing programs for formerly incarcerated people are chronically underfunded and have far more demand than capacity. They need to report to a parole or probation officer, often within 24 to 48 hours of release, an office that may be in a different part of the city, accessible only by public transportation they don't have money for. The architecture of reentry in America is not designed for success. It is designed, in the assessment of many criminologists for failure. Within 3 years of release, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics' most comprehensive recidivism study, tracking more than 400,000 prisoners released across 30 states, approximately 2/3 had been rearrested. Within 5 years, that number approached 3/4. These numbers are cited frequently in policy debates. What they are rarely used for, at the level of actual policy, is to ask the question they most obviously demand. Why? Not why in the sense of individual moral failure, but why in the sense of system design. If you release someone with $40, no ID, no housing, no job, a criminal record that will follow them on every application they fill out for the rest of their life, a brain rewired by years of institutional trauma, untreated mental health conditions, and a parole system that has the legal authority to return them to prison for missing an appointment or failing a drug test. Why is anyone surprised when 2/3 of them end up back inside within 3 years? The formal legal barriers facing people with felony convictions in the United States are so extensive that legal scholars have given them a name: collateral consequences. The Collateral Consequences Resource Center has documented more than 44,000 individual statutory provisions across federal and state law that impose restrictions, prohibitions, or penalties based on a criminal record. 44,000. These provisions affect almost every area of life. Employment. Most private employers are legally permitted to conduct criminal background checks and decline to hire applicants with felony convictions. Housing. Public housing authorities are permitted to deny housing to people with certain criminal records. Many private landlords have blanket policies against renting to people with felony convictions. Public benefits. The 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act included a provision, still in effect in many states, that permanently bans people with felony drug convictions from receiving food stamps or welfare benefits. Voting. According to the Sentencing Project, approximately 4.6 million Americans are currently disenfranchised due to felony convictions. Student loans. Federal financial aid eligibility is restricted for people with drug convictions, a provision that effectively closes the door to higher education at the very moment when education represents one of the most documented pathways to successful reintegration. The cumulative weight of these restrictions is not abstract. It is the daily reality of millions of Americans who have served their sentences, who have, in the legal language of the system, paid their debt to society, and yet continue to pay in ways the sentence itself never specified. The human cost of mass incarceration does not begin and end with the person who is incarcerated. It radiates outward. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than 2.7 million children in the United States have a parent who is currently incarcerated. That is roughly 1 in every 28 children. A 2015 study published in JAMA Pediatrics found that parental incarceration is associated with significantly elevated rates of anxiety, depression, learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and developmental delays in affected children. The study classified parental incarceration as an adverse childhood experience, in the same category as abuse, neglect, and household violence. These are children who did nothing. They did not commit a crime. They were not convicted. They were not sentenced. But they're serving a sentence of a different kind. And those children grow up. And the research tracks what happens when they do. Children with incarcerated parents are, according to multiple longitudinal studies, significantly more likely to themselves become involved in the criminal justice system. The cycle documents itself. Reentry organizations across the United States, many of them founded and staffed by formerly incarcerated people, are providing what the official system fails to provide: transitional housing, job training, mental health support, ID assistance, mentorship, and community. The Fortune Society in New York City has documented success rates in housing and employment placement that significantly exceed the national recidivism averages for the populations it serves. Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, founded by Father Greg Boyle in 1988 and now the largest gang intervention and reentry program in the world, employs formerly incarcerated and gang-involved individuals directly, providing jobs, therapy, education, and tattoo removal services that help people navigate a job market that judges their appearance as well as their record. The research on what works in reentry is not mysterious. It is not contested. Stable housing, employment with living wages, mental health treatment, substance use treatment that is evidence-based, education, and, perhaps most importantly, community. The restoration of the social bonds that incarceration systematically destroys. These things work. They are not widely available. They are not consistently funded. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation on earth. With approximately 2 million people currently incarcerated, the United States leads every country in the world, including authoritarian states that make no pretense of valuing individual liberty. The cost of this system to taxpayers is, according to a Vera Institute analysis, more than $80 billion per year at the state and federal level alone. When the costs borne by incarcerated people, their families, and their communities are included, researchers at Washington University in St. Louis estimated the full societal cost at more than $1 trillion annually. $1 trillion spent on a system that, by its own primary metric, recidivism, is failing at its central stated purpose. And yet the conversation about reforming it remains frustratingly slow. Not because the evidence is unclear. The evidence is extraordinarily clear. But because prisons are, for many communities and many political systems, useful. They're employers. They are political symbols. They're the answer that doesn't require thinking about questions of poverty, mental illness, addiction, education, housing, and the structural conditions that drive most crime in the first place. The cell is easier than the question. Robert Desnick, the man from our opening, who spent 9 months in protective custody and stood on a sidewalk for 11 minutes, not knowing which direction to walk. He found a direction eventually. He connected with a reentry organization in his city. He found transitional housing. He found work. He has not returned to prison. His story is documented. His outcome is real, but he will tell you, and has told journalists who interviewed him, that his success had almost nothing to do with what the system provided. It had everything to do with what he found outside of it. The people, the organizations, the human beings who decided that his life after the gate mattered. He is one of the lucky ones. Every day, thousands of people walk through that gate who will not be as lucky. Not because they are less deserving, not because they tried less hard, but because the system that held them, the system that cost $1 trillion and consumed years of their lives, gave them $40 and a bus ticket, and called it justice. What you just watched is not a story about criminals. It is a story about a system built by choices, legislative choices, funding choices, political choices, made over decades by people responding to real problems with solutions that created larger ones. The intake that strips identity, the cell that rewires the mind, the yard that builds a parallel society because the official one abandoned its responsibility, the medical ward that watches people deteriorate, the gate that opens into a world designed to push them back. None of this is inevitable. Every country that has chosen a different approach, countries that have invested in rehabilitation over punishment, in treatment over warehousing, in reintegration over exclusion, has documented better outcomes. Lower recidivism, lower crime, lower cost. The evidence exists. The only question that remains, is whether we are willing to look at it. You just did. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 20% of the world's incarcerated people. That is a choice, not an accident. If anything in this documentary moved you, if a number stopped you, or a name stayed with you, the most powerful thing you can do is stay informed. Share this. Talk about it. Because the people inside those cells will be outside them one day. And the world they come back to, the one we build or fail to build for them, is the one all of us live in. Both of those stories are waiting for you. The truth doesn't stop here.